The night Caleb Mercer turned 13, the wind was already clawing at the edges of town, like it was trying to pull the buildings off their foundations. Snow came in sideways sheets across the abandoned rail yard, and the river at the edge of Briar Hollow had frozen thick and silent. Inside a small duplex on Alder Street, a boy stood in the doorway with a backpack at his feet, while his mother stared at the floor, and his stepfather stared at him. "You are old enough now," the man said, the voice flat from too many evenings soaked in cheap whiskey, old enough to figure it out. Caleb had always been small for his age, narrow shoulders, hands that looked younger than the rest of him, but his eyes did not look 13 that night. They looked older. They looked like someone who understood that sometimes doors close and no one comes running after you. He walked out with a sleeping bag, a metal thermos, and a folded photograph of his grandfather, Elias Mercer, to the only person who had ever shown him how to build something from nothing. His mother did not follow him. The door shut. The wind swallowed the sound. Briar Hollow was the kind of mountain town that believed it could handle anything. It had survived layoffs at the sawmill, floods that chewed through the lower streets, and winters that snapped tree trunks in half. But what it had not survived well was pride. People kept to themselves. They heated their houses, salted their driveways, and pretended everyone else was doing just fine. Caleb did not go to the shelters. He knew the shelters. Too bright, too loud, too temporary. Instead, he followed the river trail up toward the old quarry, where his grandfather used to take him on weekends. Elias had been a stonemason who never fully trusted wood in a blizzard. Wood burned. Wood cracked. Wood bowed under snow. Stone stayed. 3 years earlier, before Elias died, he had shown Caleb something on the north face of the quarry. A shallow natural cave carved by centuries of freeze and thaw. Nothing dramatic, just a hollow in the rock wall, half hidden by brush and drifted sand. But Elias had crouched there, palm pressed to the interior stone, and smiled. "Feel that," he had said. "Even in winter, the rock remembers the summer." Caleb pressed his own palm to that same stone on the night he was kicked out. The wind roared behind him, but inside the hollow there was a stillness. Not warm. Not yet. But not biting either. The air did not move. The stone held a steady coolness that felt different from the violent cold outside. He crawled inside and unrolled his sleeping bag. Snow sealed the entrance halfway before midnight. The world beyond the cave disappeared into white noise. That first night, he did not sleep much. Every gust made him think the mountain itself was shifting. But the temperature inside the hollow never dropped to the brutal level outside. It hovered in a strange middle ground, cold enough that his breath fogged, warm enough that he did not feel his fingers stiffen into pain. By morning, he understood something his grandfather had tried to explain without using complicated words. The earth is not the same as the air. The air panics. The earth endures. For the next week, Caleb did what desperate people do. He scavenged. He moved carefully through town in the early hours, collecting discarded pallets behind the hardware store, broken bricks from a demolished chimney, on sheets of insulation board tossed near a renovation site. He carried everything back up the river trail on a rusted sled he found near the park. Most people in Briar Hollow assumed he was staying with friends. Children disappear quietly in small towns. Adults convince themselves there is an explanation that does not require involvement. Caleb did not think of himself as building a mansion. He thought of it as building a wall against the wind. He started by clearing the cave deeper into the rock. The hollow only extended a few feet naturally, but the quarry stone was layered shale and sandstone, fractured enough to chip away with a borrowed masonry hammer he never returned. He worked slowly, widening the chamber inch by inch. He shaped the back wall into a gentle curve so there were no sharp corners for cold air to collect. When he was exhausted, he would sit in the entrance and watch the town lights below. He could see the church steeple, the mill's silent smokestack, the neat rows of houses with smoke rising straight up into the brittle air. It looked peaceful from a distance. It looked safe. Inside his cave, he began lining the floor with broken brick. Over that he laid pallets, then insulation board, then another layer of salvaged plywood. He built up the walls with stacked stone and packed the gaps with clay and river sand. The entrance he narrowed deliberately, leaving just enough space to crawl through. Cold air falls, warm air rises. He remembered his grandfather explaining that by pointing at a kettle on a stove. By the end of the second week, the space inside had transformed. It was no longer a hollow. It was a room. He rigged a small vent using a length of metal duct he found behind the school gym during a renovation. He angled it upward, through a natural fissure in the rock, so smoke could escape without letting wind blast straight inside. Nor for heat, he used a tiny camping stove at first, careful never to let fumes build up. Later, he would improve that system. One afternoon, while shaping a niche into the rock for storage, he paused and looked around. The walls were layered stone. The ceiling arched naturally. The entrance was framed with salvaged timber and lined with thick canvas. He had carved shelves directly into the rock face. He had built a sleeping platform, raised from the floor. The cave felt less like hiding and more like intention. Up in the mountains, snow had begun to stack in deeper drifts than usual. The radio in the grocery store started using phrases that made people glance at each other. Historic front approaching. Pressure dropping fast. Prepare for extended outage. Caleb heard it while buying a single can of beans, with the last of the coins he had taken from his bedroom jar. He watched the cashier shake her head at the weather report. This one is going to be ugly. That night in the cave, he lay awake thinking about the town below. He thought about houses built of thin siding and aging insulation. He thought about power lines that ran exposed across open fields. He thought about furnaces that depended on electricity to ignite. He imagined the wind hitting Briar Hollow, the way it had hit his back the night he was thrown out. Relentless. Indifferent. He stepped outside and looked at the sky. The clouds were rolling low and heavy, moving with purpose. Inside the cave, the air felt steady. The stone walls did not care about forecasts. He added another layer of insulation to the entrance. He reinforced the roof of the chamber with more salvaged timber, wedged tight against the rock. He dug a shallow trench just inside the doorway to catch meltwater. He stocked what little food he had into the carved shelves. By the time the first flakes of the coming blizzard began to fall, Caleb Mercer was no longer just surviving in a hole in the mountain. He was building something that might outlast the storm. And as the wind began to rise, as the town below hurried to secure shutters and fill bathtubs, a 13-year-old boy sat inside a cave carved by his own hands, listening to the mountain breathe and wondering if he had prepared enough. The blizzard did not arrive all at once. It crept in with a strange silence that made the town uneasy. The sky turned the color of unpolished steel, and the air felt heavy, like it was waiting for permission to break loose. Caleb was awake when the first real gust slammed into the quarry wall. The sound rolled through the stone like distant thunder. Snow began to pack against the narrowed entrance of his cave, sealing it tighter with every passing hour. Inside, the air remained steady. Cool, but not brutal. Still, but not suffocating. He lit the small stove and watched the temperature shift slowly, patiently. The stone did not change quickly. That was the point. It absorbed the warmth without protest, holding it the way the earth always had. Outside, the wind howled down the valley and erased the trail leading to his shelter. By nightfall, the power in Briar Hollow flickered once, twice, then went dark. Down in town, furnaces died mid-cycle. Electric baseboard heaters went cold. Houses that had felt comfortable only hours earlier began to surrender their warmth to the storm. Wind pushed snow into attic vents and under door frames. Old windows trembled in their casings. Caleb could not see any of that from inside the cave, but he felt the difference in the air pressure. He felt the storm trying to pry at the mountain. He fed the stove sparingly, a little at a time, enough to bring the interior to a steady, livable warmth. The stone walls absorbed the heat and gave it back slowly. He lay on his raised platform, listening to the roar above him. The cave did not shake. It did not creak. It simply existed. Sometime after midnight, he heard something different beneath the wind. A faint, rhythmic thudding. Not natural. Not random. He crawled toward the entrance and pressed his ear against the canvas lining. The sound came again. A dull pounding, followed by a voice carried in fragments between gusts. Help! For a moment he froze. Every instinct told him to stay inside. He had built this place for himself, to survive, to disappear. The pounding came again, weaker this time. He pulled back the canvas and dug his hands into the drifted snow sealing the entrance. Cold bit through his gloves instantly. He shoved and kicked until a narrow opening appeared. Through the white haze, he saw two shapes stumbling along the quarry path. A woman and a small child, wrapped in coats that were already stiff with ice. It was Mrs. Harlow from 3 streets over. Caleb recognized the bright scarf even through the snow. The little boy clinging to her hand was her grandson, visiting for the week. Their car must have stalled. The road up toward the ridge was completely buried now. Caleb stepped out into the wind and grabbed the boy first, dragging him toward the opening. Mrs. Harlow followed, nearly collapsing as the gusts slammed into her back. Inside the cave, he sealed the entrance again and helped them sit near the stove. The temperature difference was immediate. Not tropical, not luxurious, but survivable. Mrs. Harlow stared at the stone walls, her breath slowing as warmth returned to her face. "You built this," she whispered. Caleb nodded, unsure what to say. The boy began to cry softly, not from fear anymore, but from relief. For the next hour, Caleb fed the stove and wrapped them in the spare blankets he had collected. He watched color return to their skin. He watched their shivering ease. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow hammered against the quarry face, and wind screamed down the river channel. Mrs. Harlow looked at him again, eyes clearer now. "There are others still out there," she said quietly. "The power is gone everywhere." The shelter filled up fast. Some families tried to drive toward the highway before it closed. Caleb felt the weight of that information settle inside him. Though he had built enough space for himself, maybe for 2 more, not for a town. But the cave was deeper than it had been when he first crawled into it, and the mountain still had room. He stepped into the back chamber and stared at the unfinished section of rock he had intended to carve later in the winter. The tools leaned against the wall. The stone was fractured in layers that could be chipped away with patience. He looked back at Mrs. Harlow and the boy. Then he picked up the hammer. For the next several hours, between feeding the stove and checking on his unexpected guests, Caleb chipped at the rock. Each strike echoed through the chamber, but the storm outside swallowed the sound. Stone fell away in slabs. Dust coated his gloves and hair. The cave slowly expanded. By dawn, the blizzard had buried most of Briar Hollow. Snowdrifts climbed halfway up front doors. Roofs groaned under the weight. Inside unheated houses, temperatures had plummeted far below comfort. The pipes froze. Breath crystallized in bedrooms. Mid-morning, another sound reached the cave entrance. Faint voices. A desperate knocking. Caleb did not hesitate this time. He dug through the drift again and pulled in 2 more figures, a father and his teenage daughter from the edge of town. Their truck had slid into a ditch when they tried to reach the emergency center. The cave filled with the scent of wet wool and cold air. It should have felt cramped. It should have felt chaotic. Instead, the stone walls seemed to absorb the tension as easily as they absorbed heat. The temperature inside held steady. The air remained breathable because of the angled vent Caleb had carved. Moisture did not condense into dripping frost the way it did inside the wooden houses below. The earth buffered everything. As the hours passed, Caleb felt something change inside himself. He was no longer just surviving a storm that might have erased him. He was holding space for others. At one point, while he chipped away at the expanding back chamber, the father from the truck stepped beside him. "You did this alone," he said. Caleb shrugged, breath fogging faintly in the lamplight. The man studied the rock walls, the layered insulation, the careful slope of the floor. "If you had been me," the man asked quietly, "and the storm was coming, and no one believed a kid could build something like this, what would you have done in that situation?" Caleb paused. The hammer hung loosely in his hand. He did not answer right away. He had been thrown out, ignored, overlooked, and he had chosen to build instead of beg. Maybe that was the only answer. If you were there, standing in that kind of cold with everyone doubting you, what would you have done? Would you have walked away or trusted what you knew in your gut? Tell us what you think. By the second night of the blizzard, 7 people were inside the cave. It should have been unbearable. But the thermal mass of the mountain held steady, the small stove working efficiently against stone that refused to let heat escape in violent swings. Children slept against rock walls that felt gently warm. Adults sat in quiet disbelief as wind battered the quarry face without breaking through. At some point, as exhaustion settled over everyone, Mrs. Harlow reached for Caleb's hand. "If you have ever felt alone, or like life suddenly became overwhelming," she said softly, almost to herself, "consider subscribing to stay connected with this community." She caught herself and smiled faintly. Sometimes the only way through is remembering you are not the only one fighting the storm. Caleb did not fully understand the words in that moment. He only knew that the cave was no longer just his hiding place. It had become the safest building in Briar Hollow. And outside, the storm was not finished yet. By the 3rd morning, the blizzard had erased Briar Hollow from the map. Roofs were rounded into white mounds. Cars disappeared completely. The main road looked like a frozen river, unbroken and endless. No plows had made it through. No emergency trucks. No hum of generators. Just wind carving new shapes out of old streets. Inside the cave, the air was steady. Not warm in a way that made you forget the storm, but steady in a way that let your body rest. The stone walls held their quiet promise. The small stove glowed low. The vent Caleb had angled through the fissure continued to draw smoke upward, even as snow piled deep outside. 7 people sat inside a chamber carved by a 13-year-old who had nowhere else to go. The father from the truck had stopped asking questions. He had started helping instead. He reinforced the entrance with additional boards, scavenged from the sled Caleb had used. The teenage daughter organized food into careful portions. Mrs. Harlow told stories to keep the younger boy calm. No one spoke about the irony, that the safest structure in town was the one no one believed in. By mid-afternoon, a faint tapping echoed from the entrance again. Not frantic this time, just weak. Caleb and the father dug outward together, hands numb even through gloves. They opened a narrow gap and found 2 more figures half buried in drifted snow. The town's volunteer fire chief and his wife. They had been checking houses when the wind shifted and erased their tracks. They stumbled inside, stunned by what they saw. The fire chief ran his hand along the interior wall. Solid stone, packed seams, layered insulation, no visible frost, no dripping condensation. "How is this holding?" he asked, almost accusingly. Caleb looked at the wall the way someone might look at an old friend. "It is not fighting the storm," he said quietly. "It is working with the mountain." The chief nodded slowly. Outside, houses were losing heat by the hour. Inside here, the earth itself was the heater. Night fell again. The wind did not. But something had shifted. The cave was no longer temporary refuge. It was command center, the only stable place in reach. People who could move at all began making their way toward the quarry, following faint memory of its location when the storm briefly calmed between gusts. By the end of the fourth day, 12 people occupied the space. Caleb had expanded the back chamber enough to fit them in tight rows. He cut a second small vent to maintain airflow. He rationed the stove carefully, explaining why short bursts of heat were better than constant roaring flame. The stone absorbed and returned warmth more efficiently that way. The adults listened, not because he was loud, not because he demanded it, but because what he built was working. In the town below, pipes had burst in 3 homes. A roof had partially collapsed near the church. The emergency shelter had run out of fuel on the second night. Those who could still walk made their way uphill. The cave did not feel like a mansion in the way magazines use that word. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, no sweeping staircases. But it had rooms carved from earth. It had layered walls. It had air that did not bite the lungs. It had stability. And compared to the chaos below, it felt enormous. On the 5th morning, the wind finally began to weaken. The sky shifted from violent gray to pale silver. Snow still fell, but softly now. The fire chief crawled toward the entrance and widened it carefully. Light poured in for the first time in days, blinding, clean. They stepped outside one by one. Briar Hollow looked unrecognizable. Snow drifts reached windowsills. Fences vanished completely. The road was a smooth white plain. But people were alive, because when the power grid failed, when furnaces stopped, when insulation proved thinner than comfort had promised, a cave in the mountain held steady. Word spread quickly once the county plows finally carved a path into town. Reporters came later. Inspectors, engineers curious about airflow and thermal retention. They asked Caleb questions he did not have technical words for. He told them about stone remembering summer, about cold air falling, about narrowing entrances and raising sleeping platforms, about not trying to beat nature, but learning its rhythm. They called it earth shelter engineering, passive thermal stabilization, for natural mass insulation. Caleb still called it listening. When his stepfather eventually stood at the edge of the quarry weeks later, staring at the expanded entrance framed in stone and timber, he did not speak at first. "You built this," he said finally. Caleb nodded. The man looked smaller somehow. The storm had not been kind to his pride. "I thought you would come back," he admitted. Caleb looked past him at the town below. Smoke rising again, roofs repaired, people moving carefully but alive. "I did not need to," he said. The cave remained after the snow melted. The expanded chambers dried fully in spring sunlight. The town council asked Caleb to help design reinforced earth shelters for emergency use. Families who once laughed now requested guidance on carving partial berms into their foundations. The mountain became part of the town instead of just its backdrop. And the cave that began as a desperate hiding place became a blueprint. Years later, people would still refer to it as the Cave Mansion. Not because it glittered, but because when everything else failed, it stood like a fortress, carved from patience. To those of you who stayed with this story until the very end, thank you. Stories like this remind us that resilience does not always look loud or polished. Sometimes it looks like a kid with a hammer in a mountain, refusing to surrender. If this moved you even a little, carry that feeling forward. There are more stories here waiting for you, stories about quiet builders and unexpected strength. And maybe, the next time a storm rolls in over your own life, you will remember a boy who listened to stone instead of fear and chose to build.